The Sunday Mirror has a grim front page there saying that this week we will hit 100,000 official fatalities from COVID-19. We're one of the worst in the world. The Observer has a story about a mass outbreak of COVID at DVLA in Wales. And finally, the Sunday Times is focusing. We have the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, on the show, and on cue they have a big polling-based story, Our Disunited Kingdom, looking at the sheer numbers of people in Scotland, Wales and indeed Northern Ireland who are thinking about leaving the UK. That is going to be one of the really big political stories of the year ahead. Now, I'm joined by our Scotland political editor, Glenn Campbell in Glasgow, and by the political correspondent of the Yorkshire Post, Jerry Scott, as well. Glenn, can I just start with you and this front page of the Sunday Times with a lot of words inside. This is not exactly news to those of us who've been following the Scottish story, is it?
No, but what this front page, Our Disunited Kingdom, is looking at is what Professor John Curtis, the polling expert, says is a situation where the foundations of the UK are fragile, not just in Scotland, but also in Northern Ireland, with the Sunday Times polling suggesting narrow majorities in both areas for there being referendums in the next 5 years on their future with the UK. And the polling also looks at the position in Scotland, where there's been a long run now, a trend in the polling suggesting majority support for independence. The panel-based survey for today's edition, surveying around 1,200 people, suggesting a majority of 52%. The polling also suggests that the SNP is on course to win an overall majority in the Scottish Parliament elections due in May. That's something that's very difficult to do in a Parliament with a partly proportional system of voting. And of course the SNP go into that election demanding another referendum on Scottish independence, and today setting out plans for how they would try to push for that if the UK government did not agree to hold such a referendum. They're talking about passing the legislation for a referendum through the Scottish Parliament, anticipating a court challenge and going to court to try and test the powers of the Scottish Parliament to hold such a vote.
And Glenn, if people are wondering why this is happening, there seem to be, from reading from the stories and looking at the polling and looking at common sense as well, two reasons for it. Boris Johnson is not popular in Scotland and Brexit is not popular in Scotland. Is that really what's rocket fueling the independence movement at the moment, do you think?
A lot of the analysis suggests that leaving the European Union, which was something Scottish voters rejected in the 2016 referendum, has been driving increasing support for independence. It's true that Boris Johnson is not popular in Scotland, and this polling reflects that. It also reflects that Nicola Sturgeon's handling of the pandemic is perceived to be very strong, whereas Boris Johnson's is perceived to be very weak. So I think all of those things
are very interesting. Yes. OK. Jerry Scott, it's taken some time for the government in London to really focus on this issue. It's been strangely slow to do so, but according to this, they are now doing so. Just talk us through what the government in London is doing to try and head off Scottish independence.
I think you're quite right. I think it's been ignored whilst they've been dealing with other things. I mean, it's the next big fight, isn't it? Forget Brexit, this is what's coming next. I mean, I guess the overall way they're dealing with it is saying, no, you can't have it. But there's been this cabinet committee that's been convened by Michael Gove to kind of discuss a campaign to build a new case for the union. And we've heard time and time again, you know, Boris Johnson is the minister for the union, and he's very proud of that. And they've got Oliver Lewis in, who in Westminster circles is known as Sonic, and he really led on the Brexit campaign. And they're even bringing in talks with former Prime Minister Gordon Brown as well, who's leading a constitutional review for Labour on the issue. So, you know, I think Westminster's really alive to this, but there's a 5-step programme that's been detailed today. And it kind of ranges from, you know, really fighting the Scottish elections hard, opposing a referendum and hoping that the SNP kind of fight between themselves, and then and only then really considering handing over more powers, but all on their terms, right? So they want to control any kind of timings of any votes. There's a focus on being more multicultural, the cabinet being more multicultural than, say, Germany or France, and looking to green issues and tech. And I think this is a massive issue, really, for Boris Johnson's government, because he would have to resign.
I'm sorry, Jay. Some of us struggle a little bit to see how devolution for Teesside or Coventry, and pointing to having Priti Patel in the cabinet, is going to turn the SNP tide, but there we are. We're in the slightly strange position of me wanting to ask you about independence, because I had Boris Johnson on the show a little while ago, and you may have noticed he thought there should be a 40-year gap between the last independence referendum and any future one. What's your response?
Well, it's Robert Burns' birthday tomorrow, our annual Burns Day, and when I hear Boris Johnson talk about this, I kind of bring to mind a Burns poem, you know, Cowran timorous beastie, what a panic's in thy breastie. He's frightened of democracy. The polls now show that a majority of people in Scotland want independence. If the SNP win the Scottish election in a few months' time on a proposition of giving the people that choice, then what Democrat could rightly stand in the way of that? So Boris Johnson clearly just fears the verdict and the will of the Scottish people.
You say in a few months' time, therefore you're not going to delay these elections because of the coronavirus pandemic.
I see no reason why the election should be delayed, but rightly and properly in a democracy, it shouldn't simply be a decision for government. That would be a cross-party decision. We have legislation that had recently passed to put contingency arrangements in place. We might have to do the election differently, more postal voting, for example, but I see no reason why it shouldn't go ahead at this stage. Many countries have had elections over the course of the pandemic.
If you do win well in those elections, will you have an advisory referendum, whatever Westminster says, a homemade Scottish referendum, yes or no?
I want to have a legal referendum. That's what I'm going to seek the authority of the Scottish people for in May. And if they give me that authority, that's what I intend to do. Have a legal referendum to give people in Scotland the right to choose. That's democracy. It's not about what I want or about what Boris Johnson wants. It's about what the people of Scotland want. And the increasing evidence is that they want independence.
Nicola Sturgeon, thanks very much indeed.